Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you, as I always do, from my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the wood of the Holly. That's Hollywood. With me today on the other side of this digital divide is a big time brainiac coming to you from the ivy covered walls of Yale University. He's Samuel Aaron Moyn. He is the Chancellor Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale. He was previously at Columbia University as a professor of law and history, got his PhD where I got my undergrad, although he got it some years after I was there. At UC Berkeley, his research interests are in modern European history, intellectual history, special interests in France and Germany, political and legal thought. And really, I think what I'm trying to get is an ability to understand our current moment, where we are coming from, and maybe, who knows, where we might be going. Either way, we're going to break it down. He's right here with me. Welcome, Professor Samuel Moyn. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me. Good to be with you.
Oh, my pleasure. So you're sitting there in a very beautiful office. I guess you're on campus. I have no idea. Maybe in your home. I'm not sure. Um, the first thing that comes to mind, since you're in the Ivy League there, and academia has really been under assault in the last over the last year or so, especially Harvard and even here at UCLA and Berkeley. Ironically, I'm not hearing that much about what's going on at Yale in relation to some of these same issues.
That's accurate. Now, in fairness, Congress, as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill, so-called, passed an eightfold tax hike on rich universities like Yale. So we're in austerity because that's a massive new bill of hundreds of millions of dollars. But aside from like scientists losing their grants on a kind of one-off basis, we haven't been targeted at Yale in the way that Columbia, especially, and
Mm-hmm.
Harvard have been. And there are a lot of theories about why, but I think it's that we're always a little bit under the radar relative to more urban institutions. But there are a lot of other theories, but so far so good.
Right. So I guess you're just trying to hang low, and I mean, not you individually, but to sort of escape the ravages of, what's going on. It all seems to me, though, as part of a larger assault on a term that we'll talk about: liberalism, uh,
Yeah.
intellectual pursuit, honesty, and the truth of our history. All of which seems to be under a political assault. And you wrote a book about liberalism called Liberalism Against Itself, which, as I was wading through it, is a sort of intellectual survey of liberal thought. And firstly, I kind of want to understand. I identify as a person who is liberal, and for me, liberalism means, maybe the world's a little more fair. Maybe the ravages of capitalism are regulated, if not completely obliterated. Uh, as a way to carve out just a freer and safer world. But you wrote about how this idea, as at least I understand it, has kind of taken a left turn or gone astray or led us into a really tough corner.
Absolutely. So, most of us who were raised in the United States identify the word liberalism with the Democratic Party and Franklin Roosevelt. And Americans are really latecomers to even talking about liberalism. That movement, by name at least, was founded in the early 19th century in Europe, but Americans didn't call themselves liberals, with very few exceptions, until right after World War One. And so FDR kind of got to define liberalism, and liberalism is really the legacy of his revolution in this country. Now, I think something has gone wrong, both in the history of liberalism in general and the history of American liberalism, which is, like, since 2016, we've had to like figure out why Donald Trump is defining this era so profoundly. contrary to many people's expectations, they were blindsided in 2016. They tried to get rid of him for years. He won anyway in 2024. And so I'm one of the folks who kind of say liberals need to, in part, look in the mirror to what happened to their own movement. I'm from Missouri, not California, although I've spent some of my best years there. And what I know is that the liberals used to compete nationally, and they used to have a very different constituency. Nowadays, their constituency is really in not so much blue states, but urban settings with like rich people joining the poorest, and that's their alliance. And they've lost so many voters in the middle who are now like following Donald Trump too often. So my book is kind of like a mournful but also hopeful investigation of where liberalism went wrong philosophically and what it could do to recover in this really scary moment.
Well, I'm of a certain age where sort of the post-war liberal kind of disaster, the biggest of which was, Vietnam. And that was kind of instructive. There were a lot of big-time liberals who led us into that
Totally
quagmire, people that embraced, the legacy of FDR, whether it was Lyndon Johnson and his crew. My question is sort of, where does liberalism meet progressivism? There's a lot of isms out there floating around.
Totally.
And it's, for a layperson like myself, it's kind of like hard to get my head around what I am and what it is.
No, it's tough for all of us, honestly. I mentioned that in the 19th century, there were liberals in Europe, and actually they placed their bet on the free market by and large. And at the end of the 19th century, progressivism emerged in the United States before there were liberals, the progressive movement.
Right.
And they're really paving the way for the New Deal, which Franklin Roosevelt ends up calling liberal. But the DNA, they changed the DNA of liberalism in this country for sure, because instead of being associated with the free market, liberalism got identified with the New Deal. And so in our country, liberalism and progressivism were kind of mixed up together, rather than being alternatives to each other, which was frequently the case in Europe, although not always. So what happened, I think, in the later 20th century, like our lifetimes, you're totally right about how Lyndon Johnson is an heir of FDR, and he destroys his own Great Society project through this terrible war, and a whole generation rejects him. At first, it looks like it's because they're backing somebody else, George McGovern, who's like a peace politician. But the Democrats do so badly under his watch that that view gets closed off. And I would say the big mistake liberals make is not so much the Vietnam War, which, of course, in the end they lose. It's that they decide to, in a sense, adopt the European understanding of liberalism in the later 20th century economically. So our liberals, including, Carter, Clinton, Obama, have all been much more friendly to free markets than Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson were. And they've downsized the state because that's what everyone has been for, liberal and conservative in our country since Reagan. So my view is that liberals' bigger error was not the Vietnam War, which had a big effect on their movement, but their decision to, in a sense, Reaganize the Democratic Party. And they in a sense, abandoned the middle class, the working class, and Trump hoovered them up, especially if they were white.
Well, there you go. The last word you said, white. I think you can't really talk about this stuff without the big disease that's lurking at the core of the American soul, and that's racism. And
Yeah. Yeah.
just in my view, a lot of the people in our country who could have made common cause with Roosevelt's agenda, maybe some distribution and more
Yeah.
fairness and
Yeah.
economic regulation, got swayed by racism, or they didn't want
Yeah.
to allow blacks into unions, and the fear of integration and all this stuff has kind of
Absolutely.
corrupted a lot of this, in my view.
Absolutely. Well, there's no like omitting that part of the story. On the other hand, Barack Obama won.
Right.
Um, and a lot of the folks who, uh, you know, voted for Trump after voting for Obama were not racists. They were betrayed economically by the Democratic Party, especially if they lived in rural places. And frighteningly, in 2024, Trump has a huge success among Latinx populations who are a kind of racialized population. And even black males vote more for Trump than they had before. So I don't want to deny for a second the relevance of racism, but um, I think the Democrats have made enough of their own mistakes in failing to connect, the right constituencies that, in a sense, we need to figure out why um, they've done those things and not just say there's some eternal reason why we can't have a transracial working class party. It's true that Franklin Roosevelt didn't build it, and the New Deal didn't help a lot of African Americans
Right.
because the Deep South was in Franklin Roosevelt's party.
Exactly.
But I think there are still possibilities for uniting working people across racial lines. And I think the worst thing we could do is just write white people off as racists in advance of trying to kind of get them in on the same team as progressives who care deeply about anti-racist politics.
Yeah, I mean, I often want to ask some of my Republican frenemies, like, what's your perfect world?
Yeah.
What's this utopia that you're imagining? Help me out, because maybe I'll switch. What is it? I've never gotten an answer to that question, but
Well, they are nostalgic, especially for a time when free markets did seem to solve our problems, and Reagan was kind of had a catalytic effect on the liberals, as I mentioned earlier, not just on conservatives. And so I think what we're seeing is that the very success that Reagan had bred like long-term discontent because free markets meant under the Democrats like Clinton and Obama globalization, which meant deindustrialization and the creation of a whole group of people who are pining for better days. And, you know, it's not clear how free markets can provide those, but it's also not clear what the Democrats have to offer aside from like Biden's photo op with the unions and like friendship with the auto union.
workers.
So like we need a plan to like give Americans hope for the future, and I strongly feel that Trump is successful because he was kind of the first to say you don't see a bright future for your children in our time, American carnage. And, a lot of people do feel that way, that our best days are behind us, not ahead of us.
Yeah, and I would argue that some of the best days that they're imagining are illusory and imaginative,
Of course.
because the period that they're kind of referring to is the 50s,
Yeah.
pre
Yeah.
Brown v. Board, where all the advantages of the post-war kind of boom were really reserved for white people.
True.
I wrote a script about it, about
Yeah.
Nashville and all this stuff. And
Totally.
the bounty of the post-war world was
Yeah.
basically for white people, and the people
That's
of
totally
color
true.
did not enjoy it. And that's not only race, it's gender. My father's in the radio station business. I can remember when I was a kid and I walked down the hallway of the radio station. Each salesman was a man who raised a family, had a Lincoln, had 2 packs of cigarettes and a Rolodex on his desk, and a rotary phone, and he could support his family, send him to public school, off to college. And when I came back from college, I walked down the same hallway. It wasn't the same. There were women in those jobs, and it was
Yeah.
different. So maybe there's some nostalgia for, like, it's a masculine paternal thing in that gumbo soup.
Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly. On the other hand, that's a huge factor, and no one should want the 50s back, but we should want high growth back, because what happened in the 70s is that we lost this kind of economic setting, which made redistribution more feasible, because there was just, the pie was getting so much bigger every year. And that lasted through the 60s, which is how Lyndon Johnson could say, let's rewrite the social contract to finally include Black people. A new deal that's not, leaving out like that whole minority population. And so in the 70s, we really, since then, we've had very slow growth. And that means there's just less to go around. And it's in that circumstance, I think, that racism matters, because you can be a racist, but if there's so much wealth, you can afford to see benefits going to your fellow citizens. Whereas when the pie is barely getting bigger, you care most about your own children, and they're in competition with immigrants, which we haven't mentioned, but also those who you racialize and scapegoat. And so my view is that, like all of what you said is right, but it was kind of given teeth by this very scary situation where we have been on the rocks economically for 50 years.
Well, I guess as Europe and the Pacific Rim has caught up after the destruction, after World War II, it's a more competitive world. Sorry.
It is. It is.
And, I can remember we both went to Berkeley. I went there as an undergrad. I can tell you offhand, right now, I can still remember writing the checks for the tuition. There's $212 a quarter, $636 a year to go to UC Berkeley. And I remember, like, hey, Bob, let's go to get a hamburger at Kip's. And you go, no, I can't, man. I'm working in the bookstore. And then I go, oh, okay. He goes, I'm working my way through college, man. I'm paying my way. Well,
yeah,
you can't pay your way through college with Tuesdays and Thursday nights at the bookstore working. So
I mean, look, when I got to Berkeley, I was a Missourian. So luckily I had funding from my first year of grad school. But the most important thing was to get in-state residency for my second year, because it was still the case. I showed up in 94 that in 95, it was low. The tuition was low enough that if I did a few odd jobs, I could actually pay it and eat and live on Dwight Way and all of that. So it's just a radically different world. And kids are upset because not only do they have such like high loan burdens just trying to get a degree, which everyone else is getting too in this competitive environment, but there are just many fewer new jobs that are worth doing to go around. And so they're upset, young men trending to Trump because they see their future foreclosed. I think there are some fixes, but it's not easy, because it's very hard to figure out how to return to the high growth that makes a lot of things easy.
Right. Well, I think some of that high growth, I mean, you're an economist, you live in this world, but after Europe is flattened and Asia's in ruins,
Yeah,
America's got all the markets, everything. Our industrial base is relatively intact. It's totally intact,
totally.
and like we're get the whole apple. And
Yeah,
it took by the '70s, all of a sudden to start seeing more Volkswagens on the street. And what is that car? It's a Honda. What is that?
exactly. Yeah.
So those things just we had like this free pass for like a couple generations there.
A while, but remember, like the Europeans, West Europeans also had extraordinary growth, an economic miracle that
Right.
allowed them by really the 50s and then especially the 60s and 70s to enjoy their own very high standard of living, even though they'd been in ruins. And they also have the slowdown in the 70s, which is a global event. It's touched off by the oil shock, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's a super important observation that we kind of benefited from very particular circumstances, but there's a bigger story, and um, you're right that the rise of China, which because until recently it's been experiencing the galloping kind of expansion and growth that the Americans made famous in the 19th century and then in the middle of the 20th century. But it's unless we decide we're going to have to live within our means and let other people like the Chinese get rich, because they're people too, then we have to figure out this growth conundrum, or we have to figure out how to tell Americans who are voting for Trump that, yeah, we're going to have a different kind of economy than before, and we're living really nice lives, and it might not get better, but it's good enough. But then, like, what are they living and working for in all of their service jobs? And so we have to give them something to believe in. And I think that's really what my book about liberalism says, that what liberals used to do is provide a kind of vision of a future for us all to participate in bringing about.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we have such a thing. And Donald Trump's like a symptom of that, honestly.
Well, also, you mentioned Reagan, and I call him the PVP, Putin's vice president, that outer borough bully. But they
Sure.
both have powerful personalities. And in many ways, their
Absolutely.
personalities transcend whatever their ideas are. And
For
to what
sure.
extent do you think just personality, the warrior king thing, which I think has a psychological appeal, is the answer? I mean, even Obama was like Michael Jordan in terms of his political skills. I thought he was a
Oh, totally.
once in a generation kind of political athlete,
Absolutely.
you know. And how much is it about the power of just the candidate or the personality? I don't know.
It's you can't just manufacture that. And Kamala Harris's star-crossed candidacy is like just proof that you can't win without an adequate charisma. And if you look and sound like a triangulator, you will be seen as an inauthentic messenger for even good causes. So you're right, but you also have to have, like, FDR was charismatic.
Very much
He
so.
was in a wheelchair, but as a communicator, he was without rival, maybe until Obama. But um, he also had something to offer. So it's always going to be a little of both charisma and program. And of course, we can't manufacture charisma, but we can think deeply about, well, what kind of program do liberals need as they wait for some kind of miraculous event, like a charismatic leader to arise from their midst. Some people think it's Mamdani. I don't, but I really like aspects of his program. I just don't think he can be a nationally competitive politician right now. But it's clear that he has the kind of gifts that you're talking about,
Right.
and always smiling, knows how to talk across lines, and so forth. So we need someone, and I'm hoping in 2028 we find someone, and it's not too soon, but the crop doesn't look as promising as I'd like, honestly, on our side.
I think from Amdani from LA, looking at him,
Yeah.
what he needs to do now is just succeed as a mayor. And
Mm.
it was
Yeah, totally true.
just go
Totally true.
succeed, go make
Yeah,
life
yeah,
better,
yeah.
and have
That's
a
right.
record to show for it. And then
Agreed.
we can talk about it. You got your shot. Go take it.
That's right. That's right.
y- you
He's won
know,
an incredible victory against all odds, but it's not easy to run a city of that kind and make the change that he's promising. So if he makes a little bit and maintains his popularity, then we can talk. I agree with you.
right? I mean, I remember when I went to New York as a young film student and actor and then comedian. You could get an apartment. It's $400 a month for an apartment. Who the fuck can afford that? Well, those days are even gone. So, as a magnet for like a creative person who wants to kind of fight their way and prove themselves, it's not economically feasible in Manhattan anymore. It's just not. It's somewhere else. Now, in your op-ed, which is originally how I got focused on Samuel Moyn, it was more about. It was interesting. I really enjoyed it because it was sort of a historical survey of the emergence of executive power and how even at this moment there was even more power to still be grabbed. Who knew? I
Mhm.
thought they had reached their limits, but no, I
Yeah.
guess there's even more power that can be grabbed, especially when you have a branch of government, Congress, that's sort of
Yes.
betrayed its identity, its
Yes.
function.
Totally true. Well, so that's right. I mean, the op-ed I did is kind of a think piece about Trump's second administration because,
Mm-hmm.
I was on the side of those in response to the first administration who didn't say exactly calm down, but who said, look, we need to look for the root causes of Trump's success. And we've been talking about those. If we just focus on him and constraining him, we kind of miss that his administration is kind of shambolic. There's so much infighting in it. His own like stooges are blocking him.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, like if we're concerned about the coup he attempted, well, who stopped that? First and foremost, Mitch McConnell and Mike Pence in his own party. The second term, I think, is different. It's not like we should overstate what he's gotten done, but it's just a radically different experience. And now's the time to sort of say, well, can we build, a movement around a new form of politics, like the progressive movement tried to do? It's amazing when you look back at the history of the progressive movement. Their big successes is partly around economic issues, but mainly around like government reform.
Mm-hmm.
And they do things like change the electoral college, change the Senate. They set up and get set up a huge number of new institutions, like the kind of independent commissions that we're arguing about now and that Trump's trying to make part of the presidency. And so I think, we both need to understand how liberals, in a sense, share some of the blame for the creation of Trump's presidency, but how they also have in their history a program to do something different, which is to set up a kind of good governance program that linked to real issues that Americans care about could be a successful kind of electoral, um, program.
So when you talk about some of those progressive achievements,
Yeah,
what comes to my mind is the Civil Service Act, which
sure,
separated, the spoils system was the first hedge against that, which
totally.
is completely under assault now.
Yeah,
Essentially, anybody who's has
yeah,
any disloyalty is
that's right.
86th. So,
That's right. And the Supreme Court, with its radical theory of the unitary executive, they're kind of colluding with Trump's own radicalism in our day. But I think it's broader than just civil service because there's a lot of strife around these independent entities that, you know, that, 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 the progressives tried to set up because it, it's very important that the Constitution says, well, look, the president will have his political appointees, but then there will be these inferior officers, so-called, in Article 2 of the Constitution, that Congress can kind of figure out how to deal with. But what the Constitution doesn't say is that you can set up things like the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, or the Federal Reserve. The first example of this was actually from before the progressive movement. It was Grover Cleveland's Interstate Commerce Commission, and that was kind of the model for everything for a century. And there, the Supreme Court is saying, no, you can't like play with institutions. Either the executive has control over executive power, or you can't do it. And so all of these things that we've relied on, liberals have relied on for years, to kind of keep the presidency in check, like the Federal Reserve Board, are under threat right now. And the Supreme Court is not going to stop it, because they actually agree that it was, in a sense, unconstitutional to do what the progressives did for a century.
Well, when I think about that article, what one of the things that came to my mind was, of course, it just looms so large in our history, is Reconstruction, which was essentially, after Lincoln's assassinated, not a federal initiative. It was a congressional initiative, very often with veto overrides over the president. So that's kind of like, and the heroes of Reconstruction within government are not American presidents. They're Congress people and Charles Sumner and those folks. And we've seen a big change. That possibility seems, and you mentioned Woodrow Wilson, who was sort of an early advocate of these congressional priorities, but as he slides into executive power, he's a kind of convenient reversal.
Yeah, so you're right to go back further than the progressive era. It's just that, like, the radical Republicans in Congress weren't trying to build modern government. They definitely passed crucial laws, and you mentioned the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is like part of their plan. It's the first major law that's president vetoes, and Andrew Johnson, and they override the veto.
Right.
And they then, pass the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. So I think you're absolutely right to go back and say, when was Congress greatest? And it's in the Reconstruction era. And they really kind of do some amazing work that we need to remember. And it's anti-racist work, obviously. And it creates like political representation by blacks, of blacks in the South, for, that after Jim Crow doesn't exist for a century. Right. But the progressives then come, and some of them are racist, like Woodrow Wilson. Right. And yet they kind of say it's a new day for America, because industrialization has transformed America. And we need a new kind of government for a new economy. The size of the federal government needs to be much bigger than the Republicans in Congress in Reconstruction ever contemplated. I mean, they called for the Freedmen's Bureau and created it. Right. But they're not imagining the kind of administrative state that in the later 19th century, 30 years after the Civil War, becomes a pressing need. And so Wilson's significant because in his early career, when he's a professor, he's basically like, we need to have Congress take charge of this new administrative state and build it. But then by World War I, when he's president, he basically says, nah, Congress is kind of, not going to be the place to kind of build power for liberalism. So he begins to build the liberal presidency, which Franklin Roosevelt inherits. And it's kind of like a shortcut. And in our time, I basically argue in the op-ed that liberals have continued thinking that Congress is not the place to kind of rule the country from. That's what the radical Republicans thought in Reconstruction. But very few people, maybe the last one would be Lyndon Johnson, have thought that. Instead, they think the president is going to lead the administrative state. And so, in a sense, Trump is inheriting all that. On the liberal side, the shift from Congress to the presidency, just as much as he's inheriting some radical ideas on the conservative side.
Well, even in the current moment, it used to be the benchmark for a successful presidency was what bills he got passed. So the rights
Absolutely.
bill, even Biden, the infrastructure.
Yes.
Uh, but today, even that seems quaint, which is yielding to something called executive orders or like fiats or
Yeah,
fatwas or whatever they are.
totally.
And they don't really hold much water. They're completely reversible with the subsequent administration. But that seems to be like the last impotent grab where you
Yeah.
just order anything.
Yeah. Well, so, one reason is that we are in a gridlocked era in the sense that no president, no party can gain enough of an upper hand to legislate, especially given the role of the filibuster,
Right.
which requires 60 votes for legislation that matters in the Senate. So that means you really need to win big enough to legislate, and no party can. And so in that circumstance, it becomes very tempting to do an end run around Congress and just, uh, as you say, use executive orders. And both parties have been trending in this direction over the past 40 years. As gridlock has arisen, it's almost like a natural consequence that you'd work through the presidency. But that, as you say, still left room for Biden to choose to work through Congress on some major bills, on relief, on infrastructure when he could.
Right.
Donald Trump, no one doubts that you have to pass tax cuts or tax rises, if we should ever get them, through Congress. So he had to pass tax cuts in his first term, his major legislative accomplishment, through Congress. And of course, he had to go to Congress to renew them in the one big ugly bill. So, you're totally right. But, the question is how we imagine a world in which we can get beyond gridlock to remove some of the incentives, which are enormous, for presidents to just get their will done when they can't because of the filibuster.
Well,
Even
maybe
when they enjoy a narrow majority, the filibuster basically forces them
right.
to use executive orders. So in a sense, it's not their fault, but it's also their fault.
So, as a prescription going forward, which you intimate, might the elimination of the filibuster, which is not, I don't believe it's enshrined nowhere in the Constitution
It's
or in
not.
law. It's the rules of the Senate, which are
It's
reversible.
it's mainly been a racist thing. The main reason the filibuster was invented and perpetuated was to block civil rights legislation. And, of course, if you had a majority of senators who could act, 51, the Republicans, when they control, would get a lot done that we don't like. But Democrats, if they could win back the chamber, would also have a route to legislative action. But I think it's not just going to work to eliminate the filibuster, although I personally favor that, because ultimately you need political popularity. And so to me, it takes us back to where has liberalism been going wrong in its policies and its programs? Because one of the two parties is going to break the gridlock and knit together a big constituency, big enough to overcome the filibuster or get rid of it, or pass laws that we need. So that's really at the deep heart of the problem. But of course there are other things like the filibuster, the existence of the Senate itself, the Electoral College, that also matter. And I think the original progressives, in a sense, didn't go far enough, because they changed the way we use the Senate and the Electoral College, direct election of senators,
Right.
In the old days in the Constitution, you didn't even get to vote for your senators. They were chosen by the state legislature. So, but we just need to go much further, because it's crazy that people in Wyoming get so much say over the future of the country. Not that there's anything wrong with Wyoming, but it's just too small to matter as much as it does in national politics.
Right. My vote in California is worth a
Absolutely.
small fraction of what
You're the worst off. Yeah.
somebody in Casper, Wyoming with his
Yeah.
cows gets. It's
Yeah. On the
completely.
world stage, California would be its own country.
Exactly.
And in our world, they're hostage to folks in Iowa. Well, that's ridiculous.
Right. So if we just had like a laundry list of sort of a wish list, things that maybe the next president or Congress people say, this is what I like. Very often
Yeah.
successes are originate in losing campaigns. So you don't necessarily have to win, but you got to get this stuff in the debate. And
Yeah.
I was going to say one thing about liberalism that we were talking. I saw this YouTube video some time ago, and it never left my mind. It was almost Franklin Roosevelt's last speech before he expired, where he lists his like 10 sort of wishes for the country, the post-war nation going forward.
Yes.
He called it a new Bill of Rights of some sort.
Yes. Second Bill of Rights, State of the Union Address, 1944.
Right. If you listen to that, to me, that is the template for the progressive world going forward. And that, to me, would be the lodestar. And I kind of think that speech deserves the same prominence as the Gettysburg Address or Frederick Douglass's, July 4th speech. It belongs there, but it's just kind of buried. It's not really in the debate or in the conversation.
I totally agree with you, and it's an interesting speech, and it's from a moment we were talking about when. At the end of World War II, it was clear that the social contract needed to be rewritten, and liberals stood for a kind of new kind of welfare state. And the Europeans, you said they were in ruins, which they were, but in part for that reason, that they had suffered together across classes.
Mm-hmm.
They were willing to embrace a welfare state when Americans basically never have. And so there's so much work to do in that regard. But the progressive legacy is also like, you can't just say what you want. You have to say, well, what kind of government should we have to get it? And that's why this debate about making Congress great again and downsizing or right-sizing the presidency, to me, is so important. And I don't think ordinary people are ignorant of this. They're not just interested in like, what will the government do for me? Because the progressive movement, like most of its popularity was like good governance proposals, like why is the Senate so important, et cetera.
Right. So I think those need to be rearticulated in the political arena in a way that's digestible. Mondani did it in some fashion,
totally
around affordability.
Yeah. Although Trump is also the source of his success is affordability rhetoric.
Right.
That's how he won inflation, blah, blah, blah. So, and it's very hard to control the economy. So, right. And the New York mayor can't. So I don't like, but you're totally right. That is essential. And pocketbook issues are always going to matter.
Yeah. I mean, as I understand it, the president is like, doesn't have that many levers, to really reverse and all this stuff. It's a big battleship, and you can kind of move the rudder a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know, when I've tried to process this last election, I'm old enough to remember Nixon, whose corruption was relatively hidden. It was his cards were face down. Like Watergate, he did that. Oh my God. This guy's corruption is completely transparent. In a weird way, he's the most honestly dishonest person I've ever seen. And so is it really about him? Or is it about us? Because everything was there. We're talking about the 14th Amendment. It's right there, Section C. If you take a gun to a a political.
Sure.
You can't play.
Sure.
You bring a knife fight to a football game. Guess what? You can't go into the game. You can't play. So all this stuff has been completely obvious to anybody watching, and yet, if these results are real, he's there. So I don't.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I've been on this. I mean, there have been a lot of heated debates about this, and I guess I have been on this side of saying that Trump is us in the sense that we made him. He's not hiding the ball. We
Right.
made him. We created the conditions for his popularity, and if we just scapegoat him for our mistakes, we will continue to lose. So that's very divisive because a lot of people would just like to see the Supreme Court get rid of Trump. Well, it's not going to happen. It was never going to happen. It was a waste of our time to ask. And that's my view. And that it doesn't mean we don't need to oppose him, but we need to oppose him with a program that's popular enough to win against him when he's basically diagnosing where, among others, liberals help take the country. So then we need a new liberalism, just like progressives argued in relation to their ancestors, and Franklin Roosevelt argued, and Lyndon Johnson. So I don't know what it is in detail, and if I did,
I
we'd
wanted
be
the
talking
answer.
probably. But
This guy Moyn knows.
well, I do think I think that a new politics of opportunity is really important. We live in amid, like the greatest class inequality in American history. There are some folks who are successful, and they're the 1%. And my defining political experience is really going up to New Hampshire in 2016 in the primary season, and all the people I met said, "I'm voting for Bernie or Trump." And I was shocked because I thought, well, but these two people are so different. But they aren't, because they're both people who say the parties have failed us. They sent us to wars that the government lost. They chose to benefit the elites, not the common people. And so only a program that is seen by ordinary people to be serving the majority is one that's going to break through. And I fear that, like, the Democrats have just let Trump win repeatedly. So that's my view, but I understand the impulse to watch MSNBC and like hate Trump. I just think it's short-sighted.
I know. I rebelled against MSNBC because I felt like they were feeding me. I was in this loop of a feedback loop that made me feel good. And then all of a sudden, and I worked for Kamala. I went down to the border in Arizona and canvassed and knocked on doors because I spoke Spanish. And él no tiene respeto para ti. He doesn't respect you, meaning.
Totally.
And I was like, what? How did this happen? And I was a little bit angry at, those folks, Rachel and what's his name? I know him too. Dated a woman in one of my movies, because I felt like they were just feeding me what I really
Lawrence O'Donnell and
Lawrence,
Rachel Maddow, and
Lawrence, who dated the woman.
Well, they represent an understandable strategy in response to 2016, but I think it failed badly, and we need a new one, and that's why I wrote the op-ed, because it's sort of like, well, you need to say our government needs to be reimagined, and it's not like we just resist this president. We need to rethink the presidency.
Right. They're kind of prisoners of like the clique society,
Correct.
that now. They the feedback that they get is it's self-fulfilling, and listen, I'm doing this podcast. It's fun when I get subscribers,
Totally.
But I can't live in that world because it's so
well, but then MSNBC was not that lucrative, so they it failed economically, and they rebranded. I think it's the whole network is called something different, and it's not like resistance liberalism, which I vehemently oppose, is turned out to be lucrative. It certainly was lucrative for those hosts, and they like the attention, but it really wasn't that great. So we created an echo chamber for a tiny number of liberals,
Right.
and it didn't even succeed in facing down the echo chamber on the right of Fox News and all of their media ecosystem, let alone create this new majority we need.
Well, when I think about it, I think language matters. Make
Yeah.
America great again. And I would
Yeah.
just start with a simple word that kids in the sandbox know. And that's, is it fair? Fair. People know, they feel what's fair. Even the word justice is slightly arcane. Is this fair that Bobby gets all the building blocks and I don't get one? Like, we can start with like a fair world. And I think people can relate to that across all boundaries. And maybe
I think fairness is a great idea. So we're really on the same page.
yeah, it's not that elite a concept. You don't have to know about the Thaddeus Stevens or any of these people. You know it's fair, and if you're living in this world, you can see. And so maybe that's, I think Mamdani, was instructive because he was accessible in that way, and maybe,
Yeah,
I don't know, that's a point going forward.
I totally agree with that. I mean, you're totally right earlier that the affordability politics they're the starting point for anyone and everyone. But the question is like, what do you do next to create the kind of what's your 10-year plan for like redeeming the promise of this country from the ruins that Trump as much kind of was the first to name
Mhm.
as then advance in his own way.
Well, I was hoping to solve all these things today, and I guess I didn't, but we tried, Sam.
Well, we'll have to reconvene and check in and I will listen to you to get some good guidance
Yeah, well,
in
just look
future
for.
months
I'm
and
I'm good
years.
for jokes, and those kind of things.
Well,
Um,
we need a lot of those.
so you're very prolific. I had a chance to read the articles, and your areas of endeavor and research go across religious lines and some of the Jewish stories that are also important. And maybe with some other time we can get into that. There's another 50 hours in liberalism and Jewish thought and the convergence and the
Absolutely.
people
Well,
from
that's
Eastern Europe and Western
yeah,
Europe.
super
People like
interesting.
Fritz Stern. You read about him somewhere. And
Oh yeah, well, I was on the faculty of Columbia, and Fritz and I would have a lunch every so often before he died, and was a humane senior colleague of mine for a
my
long time.
grandfather, Frederick Brunner from Germany, who was in the banking world. He
Okay,
wrote Golden Iron, which
okay,
the Fritz Stern, and
yeah.
my grandfather gave him all his papers, which he, um,
Wow.
thanked him prolifically for
Oh,
in
incredible.
his book, because my grandfather was from this Arnold Bleichroeder
Oh, of
banking
course. Okay, well,
firm in
that's
Berlin.
incredible. Well,
He
that's a
brought it to the
famous
United
family.
States after World
I
War
see.
II. That's not my family,
I
but
understand.
my grandfather was the scion or whatever there,
Okay, I
and
get it.
brings that and he loved the history of banking and Jewish wealth in Europe, the
Ah,
Rothschilds,
fascinating,
all that
fascinating.
stuff. And he had a lot of papers that he donated to Herr Stern, which I guess helped him,
I'm
in
sure.
his own
I'm
work.
I'm
So
sure that's right. I'm sure that's right.
yeah, so there's
That's a cool connection.
a far connection.
No, Golden Iron is a great, great book, which I remember reading as a youth, and helped me decide to be a historian, which is why I was so thrilled when I got to teach at Columbia to meet Fritz and hang out with him when he was in his 80s.
Well, I think to be a historian is a glorious, glorious endeavor. I mean, when I
It
think of
really is.
my heroes are Robert Caro and
Yeah.
Barbara Tuchman, and there's some of these people are transcendent as novelists almost, and
Yes. Yes.
bring history to life. And so that you're on that track is a glorious one. I've tried to do it to some degree with my screenplays.
Exactly. Well, it's a different medium, and
Yes,
it reaches many more people.
Yeah, and it creates many more lies too. We live in the mythology of our history more than the truth, and that's a challenge. So, hey, Samuel Moyn, folks, thank you for your time and your scholarship. I appreciate it. And check out his website. Heads up on your articles, which are pretty much everywhere. And if you're into the arcane backwaters of intellectual history with the story of liberalism and how it emerges and crumbles out of the Enlightenment, check out Liberalism Against Itself. And also, I read the op-ed too about gerontocracy. And
Yeah, that's my new book, and it's much more accessible. It's for a kind of general audience. It's coming out in late May, June, 2026.
right, and how certain people of, I guess, my age and even my parents' age have enjoyed a lot of benefits at the expense of today's emerging youth. And I think that's at the core of your thesis. Maybe
It is at the core.
yeah, yeah.
Have to see reserve judgment until you read it and see if the facts and figures check out, but I think they do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a stepfather who's 98 and, who's a rabid conservative. He's got that Fox News IV in him 24/7. Yet he enjoys full health care since forever from the, Veterans Administration. And, he had that GI Bill, and he had all the benefits of the liberal world.
Exactly.
And somehow he's hateful against it. Maybe
Build Back Better. One Big Beautiful Bill is about cutting taxes, but never touching elder entitlements. So who's going to pay for this tax cut? Well, it's people who survive longer than your stepfather. I hope he has many good years, but he's leaving a legacy for the future that is going to be dreadful because they're taking a tax cut and keeping the benefits. Right. So how's that even make sense?
No, it doesn't, except if you're receiving the benefits. So if you're the benefit of things, when they take it away, you feel like the victim. The beneficiary can feel like the victim very quickly.
Well, that's right. So, but of course, actually, like elderly people tend to have more money than younger people, and they also get benefits that are not being cut. So it's kind of a witch's brew.
Right. I mean, if you've been in the stock market since the mid 70s, you've seen, your wealth. You've been riding a very happy wave.
Been a good time for finance, not for the real economy, as we discussed earlier. All that success in the stock market may not translate for ordinary workers into a better life. That's the problem. So that's
right. And I mean, I could expand on that. Is that like these country club Republicans who really want predictability and stability?
Yes.
That's their interest, which for generations was a core part of that Republican Party. Trump scares the shit out of them, I would think.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
But yet he still has their support.
Yeah.
So
confusing.
Yeah. Hey, Sam, I'm going to let you go because you probably got 10,000 undergraduates waiting for your next lecture over there in the ivy-covered walls. Thanks for hanging with me on A Rebel Without Applause. Just stay with me on the other side as I bid my legions of listeners and glorious followers. Thanks for hanging with me. Till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that, I mean namashaloha. See ya.